We're really excited to have a dynamic keynote address. We've been talking a lot about the importance of 1988, how important that was for Pittsburgh, hosting the Remaking Cities conference. And it turns out 1988 was a big year in a lot of places. Anybody that travels the conference circuit in the design world knows that Milwaukee is often a featured subject for its waterfront, for its great architecture, for its urbanism. and it turns out that the contemporary history of almost every contemporary history I hear about Milwaukee at every conference I go to begins with, well, you know, we face a number of challenges, and then in 1988 we got John Norquist as mayor. And that begins the tale of transformation. John served as mayor until, I believe it was 2004, and during that period, you know, we've been talking a lot about leadership, and during that period really led the city's efforts to transform itself, to position itself for the 21st century, and really left behind a legacy that folks are still realizing today. He left Milwaukee to go on to become the leader of the Congress for New Urbanism, where he's been a prominent international voice on these issues around the world, and we're honored to have John here today to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm here to introduce Richard Florida, who's well known, but needs an introduction by me. I've known Richard Florida since a few years before the book, the first book. And it was an important book for mayors and people who love cities because it changed the conversation about cities pretty dramatically and very quickly. That conversation about cities has gotten pretty bad. In the 1960s and 70s, most of the conversation about cities was about pathology, death, murder, poverty, decline. And not that those things weren't actually true, but it's awfully hard to sell a product when it's got all negative characteristics. Ed Banfield, the Harvard professor of urbanism, spoke about this in his book, The Unheavenly City, where he talked about the conditions that urban problems are really conditions we either can't eliminate or do not want to incur the disadvantages of eliminating them. He said, consider the problem of congestion. The presence of a great many people in one place may seem an inconvenience, but the advantages outweigh the inconvenience. To eliminate congestion must mean eliminating the city's reason for being. And yet federal policy on transportation, even when we talk about transit, is usually talking about eliminating or dramatically reducing congestion. And then we look at housing, and we always talk about the gap and the affordability issue, and the federal government plays a role in that as well, where they define low-income people as a challenge, as a problem, and it doesn't quite fit the way it should. So this discussion went on, and it reached its pinnacle maybe when the Rodney King episode happened in 1991, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors met. I was on the advisory board, and we met in an emergency session to figure out how to create an urban program, finally, that would do something for cities. But it fell flat because if all you have to do is look at the statistics, the average city in America today gets 5.5% of their budget from the federal government, and most of that is in subsidies to public housing. And so this idea of basing the conversation about cities about pathology has been a miserable failure. Milwaukee in particular has gotten 2.3%, it's at 2.3% of his budget is federal money. And yet almost all the conversation is about that. What should it be about? Well, it should be about a lot of things, but it should be about what Richard Florida talks about. Because what Richard Florida did with his first book, with the creative class, is talk about the virtues of the city, virtues of urbanism. The fact that cities are a setting for commerce, the cities are a setting for creativity, cities are a setting for addressing poverty. Because living in a city, living close to other people, some of whom have money, is better for poor people than living in a city all by themselves without anybody else around them. And so he understood that. And so he created a seam in the discussion of urbanism that was that was positive towards cities. And so it is a great pleasure for me to introduce somebody who's had a tremendous impact, positive impact, on the future of American cities and cities around the world, Richard Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor, for that kind introduction. It is really, it's more than an honor. It's more than a privilege. I don't think words can describe how honored and happy we are to be back here in Pittsburgh. As Don knows, I was at the original Remaking Cities Conference in 1988. I had just moved to Pittsburgh. I came to Pittsburgh in 1987 to accept an assistant professorship in what was then called the School of Urban and Public Affairs. And there are really two cities that have shaped my thinking. One is the city of my birth, Newark, New Jersey, where I encountered Ed Banfield's book in the Newark Public Library. A city that was defined by pathology. A city that was the poster child for urban decay. I lived in Newark and North Arlington for 17 years, 2 of those years in Newark and 15 in North Arlington. I moved to Pittsburgh and saw a city that could and would remake itself. I lived in Pittsburgh for the longest single period of my life, 17 years. And those two cities, the experience of Newark and its decay, and Pittsburgh in its emergent struggle, and now I think it's not an emergent struggle anymore. The rebirth has been achieved, that generational rebirth. But even before I came to the Remaking Cities Conference, I had an interview. And there's a story about how I got to Pittsburgh. I'll keep it short. A fellow named Gordon Clark, who was an eminent urban geographer, the Mackinder Professor of Geography at Oxford, had taken up a position at the School of Urban and Public Affairs. And they were looking to hire someone to span that school and the program in architecture. And as is typical Carnegie Mellon fashion, if I might say, which is the rumor when I came to Carnegie Mellon, it's so hard to get tenure that they would keep the boxes in the hallways so people can repack them when they were shown the door. Trust me, getting tenure at Carnegie Mellon is tough. Getting a job at Carnegie Mellon is a whole lot tougher. And many eminent people had failed, and Gordon took a flyer on me, and it was a fun visit. But in my interview, there was one person there who sold me on Pittsburgh. It was a fellow named David Lewis, who all of you know, and that's why we're here, that's why I'm here. And David looked up at me, and I'll still remember what he said, and I can't imitate his magnificent accent. He said, "Florida, that's all well and good what you say, but how would you fix Pittsburgh?" I've never forgotten that question. That ability to try to develop theories that would inform public policies. And David was my tour guide to Pittsburgh. He took me to see the great homes and buildings of Pittsburgh. He was my mentor, and he was my inspiration. That question rang in my ears. What's been accomplished here? You know, I came to understand, and maybe as I've gotten older, that economic transformations are generational events. I wrote a book about this, The Great Reset. And in Pittsburgh, when I got here, that economic transformation was just gaining steam. And you know, it was a big struggle to shuck off an older economy and older ways of doing business and older institutional forms And to build a new kind of economic system and political system was difficult. But now I think, and I think all of you will agree, whether you're from Pittsburgh or not or spent time in this magnificent city, it is an exemplar. It is the exemplar, not an exemplar. It is the exemplar of how an older industrial city can remake itself. And, you know, I live in Toronto now, a city that has a lot of great things going for it, but see, sometimes bad mayors follow me. I don't know anything about the mayor of Toronto. You're looking at probably one of the greatest, like John Norquist, the great mayor of Milwaukee. You're looking at coming into office in Pittsburgh, a dear friend of mine. We spent many a night in a place called Cappy's. Some of you may know what Cappy's is. Not only a great leader, but one of the truly great urbanists of our time. And I think that's just fitting. The fact that Pittsburgh, which has accomplished this turnaround, will now have the kind of mayor, the kind of leader, the kind of face, not only in Pittsburgh, that can project on the national scene. Well, I want to talk about two revolutions today, and the way those two revolutions are intersecting to remake our cities. When I was a young boy, I was born into a Newark that was thriving. I would sit in North Newark, in the Italian sections of Newark, with my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, my mom and my dad, my brother, my dozens of cousins. We would go to shop in one of the great shopping districts of America. Great department stores, a bustling street life, bustling ethnic communities, Italian, Polish, German, Jewish, the kind of city, well, Philip Roth wrote about it. And I watched that city decline. I watched those pathologies emerge. I watched the race riots. I heard the shots fired. And I guess I thought that's the way it was going to be. And something drew me. You know, I don't know, as a kid growing up in Newark, as a kid growing up in a working class town of North Arlington, you know, I think it was indelibly imprinted on my DNA. I was drawn to trying to understand, how could this great city fall apart? How could race riots emerge? Why were tanks rolling into my city? Why were gunshots being fired? Why were my uncles throwing meatball sandwiches over the fence to my cousin Nikki in the National Guard? But that's neither here nor there. And I guess I wanted to understand how to try to remake cities. And then I came to Pittsburgh and saw a city in the throes of remaking, but I still didn't understand. I saw a city that's core was intact. I saw a city of great neighborhoods, from Squirrel Hill to Point Breeze to Lawrenceville to the south side and the north side to Shady Side and all in between. I saw a city that had a heart and a soul and hadn't fallen apart, but was stricken with deindustrialization. And I think that's what ended up with a book called Rise of the Creative Class. It just poured out of me. It wasn't thought about. It wasn't something that was pre-thought. It just kind of poured out of me. But what's happened since that time is that cities really have come back in a way that none of us, including me, could have understood. None of us could have anticipated this great re-urban comeback that has happened since I wrote Rise of the Creative Class. Over the past decade or so, the movement of people back to cities, the decline of the old suburban dream, the creation of a new urban dream with transit and walkability and urban, integrated, diverse neighborhoods. The movement of high technology. My dear friend Joel Kotkin had a word for the method of high technology organization that was seen as dominant. He called it presciently a nerdistan. A nerdistan. Engineers and scientists needed, wanted to, had to live in suburban enclaves off highway off-ramps in places like the Silicon Valley, in the North Carolina Research Triangle, in suburban Austin, the Route 128 Beltway outside of Boston. But what have we seen? Urban theorists have always known that cities are the fonts of innovation. That's what Jane Jacobs told us. But now we've seen a movement of high technology companies back from Silicon Valley to downtown San Francisco, into the heart of New York City, out of the Route 128 suburbs and back down to Boston and Cambridge, right in the heart and soul of Pittsburgh. Our cities are back because they're where people want to live. And they offer us a different kind of lifestyle than my parents wanted. A lifestyle that is more fulfilling, that has a higher quality of life, that is more diverse, but also is more economically productive. These are the two great revolutions that are just beginning, and they are entirely incomplete. These two great revolutions give us enormous productive potential on the one hand and tremendous urban potential on the other. But they are also leading to deep and divisive divides. Just have a look at our Congress. I just put a piece up on Atlantic cities today talking about the fact that this isn't just political dysfunction. This is a product of very real economic and geographic divides. What the Tea Party represents and what the people are trying to pull down our government represent are just the latest incarnation of a broad anti-progress, anti-urban coalition. It's not the first time this coalition has raised its head in America. And I'll tell you this, we had better get our acts together. I look at our field and the debates we have in urbanism. I look at this and I see the narcissism of small differences on steroids. There are people in this country who, given their way, will rip urban progress to shreds and rip economic progress to shreds because they feel they are not part of it. Our agenda has to be together, each and every one of us together, to build a broad and inclusive coalition. Not simply because walkability is good, not simply because diversity is good, not simply because inclusivity is good, not simply because cities are good. Because this is the font of progress, not of economic growth, but of economic and cultural and social progress. And we, each and every one of us, in the footsteps of David Lewis, are the stewards of this engine of progress. And it's time we all take that mantle seriously. The first economic revolution. We are living through the greatest economic transformation in all of human history. Bar none. Bar none. We don't think about it all day long. We go about our business. But what we have seen in Pittsburgh and Detroit and rippling through the advanced world and now through the developing and emerging world is the greatest economic shift in all of mankind. For all of human history before us, right here in Pittsburgh, what a blessed place. At the crux of three rivers, filled with abundancy of natural resources, the first great energy region in the world, with oil and coal and iron ore and all sorts of God-given gifts. For all of human history, we located ourselves around natural ports and harbors, around areas of fertile soil. We harnessed those natural resources and we built bigger and bigger communities, and we increased slowly our standard of living and our economic production. And then came the great Industrial Revolution that Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Karl Marx and all the great classical economists wrote about. It led to a surge in progress 300 years or so ago, unlike anything the world had ever seen, beginning in the industrial lands of England and very quickly shifting to the industrial areas of Boston and New England and New Jersey, and then through Pittsburgh, up through Cleveland and across Pittsburgh, all the way to Chicago and Milwaukee. But still, we had the same basic mode of economic organization. We continued to be an economic and social system that grew its economic productivity, increased its standard of living by combining natural resources with what both Adam Smith and Karl Marx told us, the physical labor power of working men. Think about how disruptive the Industrial Revolution was. Think back in your mind's eye, the rise of class struggles throughout England and Europe, coming here to the United States, the great struggles in Homestead, the rise of the Steelworkers Union, the pitched battles, the rise of the isms, communism and socialism. fascism, a civil war in the United States, 2 great world wars. And yet we didn't break with the basic logic of the production system. Economists gave us a simple formula: land, labor, and capital. We mix land, labor, and capital, and we optimize productivity. Well, what has happened over the past 2 or 3 decades? Our economic system has been upended. My professors at MIT and Columbia, they called it deindustrialization. The deindustrialization of the Mon Valley, of Greater Detroit, of the old industrial heartlands. We were experiencing deindustrialization. But we didn't collapse, did we? Pittsburgh's still here. And so is Detroit. And so is Newark. We began slowly but surely to create a new mode of production. Now, it took me a long time to try to figure this out, and I'm still trying to figure it out. And I went back and I read all the great theorists of this shift. We were shifting from an industrial to a post-industrial economy. Boy, that tells us a lot. We were moving from a manufacturing to a service economy, where people who create biotechnologies and invent software at the University of Pittsburgh or Carnegie Mellon are the same as someone flipping a burger in a fast food restaurant. A technology age, a digital age, a cybernetic age, an information economy. And then I came across the work of Peter Drucker. And Peter Drucker, in his studies in the 1950s of, guess what, General Motors, made a much more prescient argument that I made a slight emendation to. He said we were moving from an industrial to a knowledge economy where the means of production were in our minds, where the mind and mental labor was the means of production. He got it mostly right, except I was searching for a deeper answer. When Marx looked at capitalism, when he looked at the working class, he was not looking just at what economic productivity came from. He was looking at what bound us together in a joint humanity. Why the working class of England and Europe and Germany and the advanced and progressive working class he wrote about in America. Why the working class and the labor movement was the font of progress. And he said that simply wasn't because workers used their physical labor to produce things. He said that's because our physical labor is what differentiates us from other species that walk the earth. What made humans human, he said in his moral philosophy, in his moral economics, was the fact that workers share their physical labor, his word, intersubjectivity. We work together in a division of labor to produce steel or cars or whatever. It's not our knowledge. Yes, our knowledge is powerful. Yes, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Yes, we embody living and dead knowledge and accumulates. Yes, it is not zero sum. It is something that we can add to. But I came across a book by Robert Sternberg in the library at Carnegie Mellon. It's called The Handbook of Creativity. And Sternberg in that book says, if you go and you find yourself a great entrepreneur, a great technologist, a great artist, a great musician, and he goes on, a great business leader, a great political leader. If you go and you search, there's something that all of these people share in common. It's not just what they share. Take a look at your sons and daughters, your nieces and nephews, your grandkids, any child on a playground, any little boy and girl. What do we really share in common? What is really the thing that differentiates us? It's not our physical labor. It's not the information we acquire. It's not the knowledge we generate. It's not the technologies we build. That's why I called it a creative class. It's creativity itself, and it's been that way all along. Look, we've been through a great revolution. In the United States, we generated 20 million new jobs in the creative sector of the economy. And as my great friend and colleague Kevin Stolarik, who documented this statistically, will tell you that scientists at my kitchen table, across the street on Devonshire Road from Carnegie Mellon, that includes scientists and technologists, engineers, researchers, innovators, business professionals, managers, educators, and people who work in business and management. At a time when the United States shed millions of manufacturing jobs, although we finally stabilized that, we created millions of creative jobs. We're on track to create another 10 million. I learned yesterday from my research team the creative class now numbers 50 50 million workers, more than a third of the workforce in the United States. When the rate of unemployment in manufacturing in the United States surged among 10, in manufacturing surged over 15, in construction was 25, the rate of unemployment in the creative class never touched 5%. We're going to grow another 10 million of those jobs over the next decade. Pittsburgh has 350,000 people in the creative class. 350,000 people in the creative class, compared to 220,000 who do good, hardworking, blue-collar work. Do you know in the United States today what the share of people who actually work in factories and do direct production is, tragically? It's 6% of our workforce. Now, people hear the words creative class, and they like to have a field day with the term. And trust me, many of you know I've had my share of critics. And as I always like to say, I learn a lot. I'm a very serious person. I learn a lot from my critics. Not only does it hurt a little, forget that, it makes you introspect. It makes you go back and look. It makes you go back and re-look and relearn. And there's been several lines of criticism of my work. But one person said, does Florida really believe that our economy can really take shape around, his words, street-level guitar players and bohemians working in latte bars? Does he really seriously believe this is the source of economic growth? Has he lost his wits? I know what it is about Florida. He believes it's yuppies, trendoids, and gays. This fellow's logic. He has a gay agenda. That's what it is. It's a gay agenda. He wants to undermine the Judeo-Christian tradition and the family as we know it. Rana, is that true? My wife's here. I don't think the sisters at Our Lady of Queen of Peace, where I went to elementary school and high school, would agree either. Look, I didn't build my theory of the creative class by studying latte bars. I didn't build my theory of the creative class by studying bohemian districts. I know nothing about that. I didn't build my theory of the creative class by studying hipster districts. As Rick Stafford will attest, and Lou Mastanti will attest, and Don and David will attest, and Volker Hardcorp and Vivian will attest. What did I study when I moved to Carnegie Mellon? Factories. Factories. That's where I built my research portfolio, studying factories. I watched the factory where my dad worked decline and deindustrialize. I watched the factories and learned about the factories of Pittsburgh closing. I watched the factories all throughout Ohio, and then I got a job at Ohio State and I saw a Honda plant open. And then I came to Pittsburgh and watched the beginnings of what we then called the quality movement, the lean movement, the high-performance manufacturing movement. The Creative Class isn't my first book. It's my third. You forget the other two. The breakthrough illusion, why America makes the breakthroughs but doesn't follow through in manufacturing. And beyond mass production, why great manufacturing companies from Japan and Europe are rebuilding our manufacturing belt. You see, I wanted to understand where the seeds of a new industrial order were being built. I went and I studied all the great factories throughout this great industrial heartland, steel factories. I remember doing the tours in factories all surrounding Pittsburgh, looking at them being transformed from places of mass physical manufacturing into high-tech zones where knowledge workers were manning the control rooms. I saw this in steel mills. I saw this in robotics factories, in machine tool factories. And I remember one day when I ended up outside of Nagoya on this grand tour at a Japanese factory. It was a continuous cold rolling mill. In Pittsburgh, you should know what that is. Cold rolling is a processing pattern in a steel mill that makes just about the finished steel that you would see in a refrigerator or in a car body panel. And at this plant, the plant manager told me something. He said they had taken that process of cold rolling that even in the best plants in the United States would still take at the time 7 to 14 days, discrete batch process. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They had turned it into a continuous cold rolling mill that looked like a paper mill. A 5 to 7 minute continuous process. And I said to him, what great scientist, what great engineer, what great laboratory at Carnegie Mellon or Purdue or MIT? He said, no, Professor Florida, you got that wrong. It's the knowledge, it's the intelligence of the workers. The factory itself is a living lab. And he said something that echoes in my ears. He said, I'll tell you this, we're going to beat the big three. And the reason we're going to beat the, and I laughed at the time. I laughed at the time. The reason we're going to beat the big three is not because you don't have a great country, not because you don't have resources, not because your workers aren't great, they are. It's because of the way you manage. You think the key to success is having a great CEO and great R&D scientists and great engineers and great MBAs. But we know better. We're going to tap into the knowledge, intelligence of the tens and thousands of people in our factory and in our supply chain. And I just have to tell you one more thing. You see, I heard this first from my father. My father's name was Louis Florida. He was born in 1921 in Newark, New Jersey, the son of Italian immigrants. My dad had to take a job in 1934. In fact, he took that job on the day he turned 13. He put his books down. He excused himself from his 7th grade classroom in Newark, and he went down to Newark and got his working papers. He took up work in a factory in the ironbound section of Newark, in those great brick buildings. We still have them in Pittsburgh, in the Strip District and along the rivers, in a great big building called Victory Optical. My dad worked there until the day Pearl Harbor was attacked. He put his tools down on his workbench. He enlisted in the U.S. Army. He stormed the beaches at Normandy, and he fought in all the great battles of World War II. Came back, took a job in the very same factory making eyeglass frames. Well, I was a curious kid. And the frames look something like this. These look almost just like the frames my dad made in that factory. I know because I had to wear eyeglasses when I was 2 years old, farsighted. When I was a young kid, growing up in the 60s, I was pretty precocious, and I'd say I was a pain in the neck. And I used to ask my dad to take him to work, take me to see where he worked. I'd see my dad get dressed. I'd see him go off in his Chevy Impala. I'd see him engaged in productive activity. My dad said, no, I'm not going to take you to work. I work in the factory so you don't have to. It's your job to go to school, to get an education, and get ahead. That's how you get ahead in America. That's your dream. That's my dream for you. But I would, we didn't have take your sons and daughter to work day, did we, in the 1950s and 60s. But I would kick and scream and go crazy. And on Saturdays, when the plant was running overtime, my dad would relent. If you don't know New Jersey, just let me tell you briefly about what our drive was like. We went basically down to MacArthur Highway, over the Pulaski Highway, and where I grew up was smack dab in the middle of either, depending on what you like, Sopranos Country or the New Jersey Shore. I talk like this. Don remembers when he met me. David, how you doing here in Pittsburgh? It's a beautiful place. What you got going on? I got a Garden State Scholarship to Rutgers where I learned English as a second language. We'd enter that factory with the machines spitting out those frames, those plastic frames and metal frames. And like I am still today, I was fascinated by technology. My dad would see me looking at the machines, and he told me something I've now heard. I heard it in Japan. I've heard it in great factories, great business leaders here and all across the world. I heard it from my dad first. It's not the machines that make the factory great. It's the knowledge, it's the intelligence, it's the creativity of the people who work here. You see, that's my argument. Sometimes gets forgotten in the big debate. Every single human being is creative. It's incumbent upon us to stoke the creative furnace that lies deep within each and every single person. Yes, we should thank the stars and thank the Lord that a third of us get to use our minds in production, that a third of us have the great good privilege to be members of the creative class. We are the leading edge of that economic revolution. But what about the other 66%? As they fall further and further and further behind. That's the divide we face. That's the roots of socioeconomic inequality. A split, a bifurcated job market. Now, I could go on for a long time about this, but I want to boil this down to its essence. A third of us, 350,000 Pittsburghers, are members of the creative class. 1 in 5 of us are members of the working class. The creative class makes on average $75,000, many over $100,000. The working class still does pretty good. Members of the working class, those are the jobs we want to get back. 220,000 Pittsburghers. But nearly 50% of Americans, 48% of people in this metro, nearly 550,000 people here, are members of the service class. Where do you hear about them? We're going to educate the workforce. We're going to invest in better education, create more knowledge jobs. Oh yeah, we have 50 million of those jobs. 9 in 10 college-educated people have a creative class job. But 4 in 10 members of the creative class didn't go to college, including some of our great entrepreneurs, from Gates to Dell to Jobs and many others. 4 in 10 didn't have a college education. They still made it into the creative class. But nearly half of us toiling in service work. Well, here's what my dad told me. I'll tell you what he said. He said, Rich, when I took that job in the middle of the Great Depression in 1934, it took 9 of us to make a family wage. 9 people. I came back from the war, and as if by magic, I had a good job in the same factory. Hear that. The same job in the same factory went from the kind of job Marx bemoaned that William Blake said was work in a satanic mill, where you couldn't even make a subsistence wage, where it took 2 parents and 6 siblings to make 1 family wage, right here in Pittsburgh, in Homestead, with the steel workers. Out there in Detroit with the Reuthers. We had a great labor movement in this country. And that labor movement lifted our working class, and our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, said, and we're going to give workers the right to bargain collectively. I don't know what side of that issue we're on, but what my dad told me was he didn't really think a lot about it, but when he got back from the war, he had a good job. He could get married. He had 2 sons. We were given great Italian names, Richard and Robert. Classic Italian names, aren't it? He could put us in school with the Sisters of St. Joseph at Our Lady Queen of Peace. I have the knuckle bruises and scars to prove it. He could buy a house, a small house, buy a car, and put his 3 boys to college. We made manufacturing jobs good jobs, people. We, each and every one of us in this nation, forged a new social compact. We used to think manufacturing work, you know what? They handed my grandfather a shovel when he got off the boat from Italy, and they said, dig. Dig, Italian, dig. And he took that shovel and threw it back at them, and he said, no, you dig. We treated workers like crap. But we built a working class into a middle class. You see, that's what we have to do today. These service workers who no one wants to talk about, who no one on either side of the aisle, this is what we have to do, and we got to do that city by city, because no one in Washington is listening. We've got to elevate the people, the fastest job categories, food preparation and service, retail trade, home health care, personal aids, we can go on and on. The people who still have to toil with mom and dad and children working 2 and 3 jobs. Creativity requires diversity. Every single human being is creative. It cuts across the categories of race and gender and sexual orientation and ethnicity that we have imposed on ourselves. That's why I say creativity requires 3 T's: technology, talent, and tolerance. 50% of those high-tech companies in Silicon Valley were founded by somebody who wasn't born in America. The creative revolution, the economic revolution. But it goes hand in glove with the second revolution. Why we're all here today. The urban revolution. The urban revolution. You see, the industrial age had its own social and economic way of organizing itself. The industrial age was organized around, as my father told me, 1 job from age 13 to 65, 1 company, Victory Optical. What's good for General Motors, John Kennedy told us, is good for the country. IBM stood for I've been moved. You were a company man. You worked for 1 company for life. The Industrial Corporation was the social and economic organizing unit of Pittsburgh. But what happened? Less corporate loyalty, more employee mobility, the decline of great companies. Companies used to stay on the stock exchange for 10, 20, 30 years. Now they stay on the stock exchange for a blink of an eye. They're on in the Roth. Cities, communities, places are the social and economic organizing unit of the creative age. We are stewards of the most important social and economic, the critical container. You know, and the person who figured that out wasn't me, it wasn't Ed Glazer, it wasn't Bruce Katz, it wasn't any one of us. It's by the late Jane Jacobs. When Bill Steigerwald, anyone know Bill? From Pittsburgh, asked her in an interview from Reason magazine what she thought was her greatest contribution, she said, I've made all these thoughts about streets and streetscapes and porches and all of this, but I think I figured out something all other economists forgot. She said all other economists, including big shot university people, they believe that economic growth comes from companies that increase efficiency by developing a more routinized division of labor. She said that can be a way of increasing efficiency, that can be a way of doing things cheaper, but it's not where economic growth comes from. Where economic growth comes from, where it has always come from, is when we come together and live together in cities. We rub shoulders with one another. We begin to talk to one another. We begin to work with one another. We begin to form little teams, and we increase the productivity. But more importantly, if we want to create something new, if we want to create new work, the only place that comes from is cities. This is what Steve Jobs said when he said, "What is Silicon Valley?" It's a place where people combine and recombine, where ideas come to mate and create new ideas. It's what Jack White said when people asked him what made Detroit a great music scene. The same thing. When bands and talented musicians come to combine and recombine in new ways, and that process of competition and collaboration, pow, comes new innovations and new sounds in music. Well, you all know the story. People are moving back to cities. We want a new way of life. We want to live more freely. We want to live in walkable places. And all of those things are important, but they're epiphenomenal. What's really core about cities is they're the font of innovation and productivity. They are our factories, to use a bad analogy. They are the factories of the knowledge age. Without cities, we don't have productivity growth. Without stronger cities in metro areas, we don't have an economic recovery. And these economic crises, these economic periods that we're living through, that we know so well in Pittsburgh and across the industrial heartland, these are generational events. I wrote about this in a book called The Great Reset. You know, we think that what gets us out of economic crisis is new models of government innovation. And then Joseph Schumpeter told us brilliantly, what gets us out of economic crisis is a new wave of technical change. My colleagues at Carnegie Mellon could tell everyone about that. You know what gets us out of economic crisis? It's new patterns of the built environment. What solved the great crisis of the 1870s and 80s wasn't a new mode of government involvement, wasn't just a new wave of technical change, although both happened. It was the fact that we reorganized our society. We moved people from farms to cities. We built Pittsburgh and Detroit and Buffalo and Cleveland and Cincinnati and Milwaukee, and I could go on. And that's what created the demand. I just spent 2 days with Larry Summers. We need more demand, and government has to create more demand. No, we have to create more demand with government's help, and the built environment and city form does that. What happened after the war? I told you about my dad working in the factory. He bought that. He said, you know, Rich, where we live here in North Arlington, that was a farm, Rich. That was a farm. Place 5 miles outside of Newark. And now I have a car and we drive here and we live in a house. Magic. The suburban revolution, some of us bemoan it. David told me, the greatest challenge of our time isn't urban inner city renewal. He told me this 25 years ago. The greatest challenge of our time is how to renew our suburbs. And that's a problem each and every one of us has to take really seriously. When we built the suburban model, what did it do? It created the demand. When my dad got that job with a rising salary, he bought that house, he bought that car, they bought the Motorola and RCA TVs, filled it up with that big old ugly wood cabinet stereo and a couple of wall air conditioners and a Kelvinator. That stoked the furnace of the steel lines and auto lines and rubber and tire lines from Pittsburgh to Detroit to Buffalo to Cleveland to Akron. There was a one-to-one correspondence. Now we're building a new model of social and geographic organization. And the old way ain't going to cut it. But we have a new way. And here's where urbanists get this wrong. We think it's all back to the city. They think it's all out to the suburbs. Sprawl versus density. And then, my dear friends, the economists who shifted gears, who will remain nameless, they used to say it was sun, skill, and sprawl which generated economic growth. If we could build more roads, if we could build more developments and build more nerdistans and edge cities, you remember these people. Sun, skill, and sprawl. Florida has it wrong with his silly 3 T's, 3 S's. The same economists are now saying build giant vertical towers in every city. Fill them up and make them all look like downtown Hong Kong or Shanghai. That's vertical sprawl. That's not a city. A city is a set of personal interactions. Thank you, guys. It's very kind. A city is built on personal interactions, on the street, as David Lewis told us and Jane Jacobs told us. It's built on people coming together and mixing and mingling. People talk about gentrification in New York, and it's a problem. And I just heard Bill de Blasio speak of a tale of two cities. I'll come to that in a minute. But I'll tell you, still in gentrified New York, with garbage bags piled to the ceiling at night, with people from every socioeconomic stratum on the subway, yeah, there's a lot we have to do, but it's not like living in a gilded gated suburb. You are coming face to face in even the most gentrified city with humanity. And the great public spaces that we built then force us to come together. They force us to come together. Our cities are our containers of diversity, are our containers of creativity. And I'm going to write my next book on this, and there's a lot we have to do to fix what's going on. But the point of fact is our cities are what shapes us. We have intensification, which is very important. But the key to understanding economic growth is not just the intensification of the core. It's the extensification. It's a dialectic. They go hand in hand. It's not just back to the city. It's not simply a great inversion, although Alan Ehrenhold has coined a terrific phrase which captures so much of it. It's not simply a great inversion. It's the intensification of the city and the expansion of the suburb into a unit I call the mega region. The Boston, New York, Washington triangle. The Shanghai to Beijing axis. It's not India that's the competitor. It's Mumbai to Bangalore. It's Rio Paulo in Brazil. We are part, you are part, of a great mega region. John Gottman named it. He named Boswash and he named one other. Shy Pits. Shy Pits. The one in this industrial heartland. The one that ranges from Pittsburgh and across the heartland to Chicago. 46 million people, nearly $2 trillion in economic output. One of the largest nations in the world. We have to not only rebuild our cities, but we have to strengthen our mega regions. This is where demand comes from. What would strengthen this? We need massive new investments in infrastructure, massive new investments in high-speed rail to knit together and to create both densification at the core and extensification. We have to build stronger regional units that go beyond the city, go beyond the metro, and encompass the mega. Look at what Pittsburgh's accomplished. I heard Mayor Bloomberg talk about this and Deputy Mayor Steele, and now it's become a mantra. I interviewed Fred Wilson last week, the great venture capitalist. What created urban technology shift? Why are high technology companies coming back to the city? In one word, quality of place. Not quality of life, quality of place. Quality of place. Safer streets. Cleaner air. I remember when we cleaned the buildings. How many of you remember when we cleaned the buildings in Pittsburgh? The black buildings that all of a sudden turned beige. When you would watch the power hoses on the buildings, turning them to their original shade. When Pittsburgh skies were blue. And cities like Pittsburgh could open their waterway from dump to a place of recreation, and waterfronts all across, and walkways. And John Norquist was a leader in this well before its time. That's what did it. And people want to be in cities. Talented people want to be in cities and can afford to be in cities because they're safer and cleaner and they have quality of place. Pittsburgh's been an exemplar of this. Oh yeah, and I bitched and I moaned about it while I was here. And I tried to push and I tried to prod. But we all know this. The greatest cycling I have ever done in my life, even while being beamed with apples and oranges, never mind, were on the hills of this city. The waterways that opened to boats, to kayaks, to all sorts, the bicycling trails, we can go on. And what I talked about in Rise of the Creative Class, the old and authentic. What did Jane Jacobs tell us? New ideas require old buildings. New ideas can sometimes arise in new buildings, but if you want to have a truly new idea, it requires a city filled with old buildings, a city of density in a particular kind of walkable density, a city where people can get out on the street. That's where real new ideas come from, and our reality is finally catching up to what urbanists have always known. But not all is good. And I came to this hard, because I'm a natural optimist. I'm a child of David Lewis. He gave me that optimism. It's hard for me to be a pessimist. I see the glass half full all the time. I can't see it half empty. What am I doing here on earth if I'm just going to bitch and moan? I got to try, and I don't have too many tools, but I have a pen and a keyboard. And I try to point at the good. But there's big troubles that confront us. I talked about the bifurcation of the labor market and our quiescence as service workers sink deeper and deeper as the creative class, despite all of its struggles, struggling artists, struggling musicians, struggling techies. But it's not like the struggles of the service class. I'm going to try to parse this in my next book, and it's a hard one. How much of this is due to the comeback of our cities itself? How much is a product of our labor market and our economic trends, and how much of it is a product of the way our cities are formed? I'm going to try to dig into this concept we call gentrification. What is gentrification? I don't have all the answers now. We've just embarked on these projects. But here's what I can tell you. When you look at the numbers, it's clear that socioeconomic inequality is not just the product of the labor market. The way we're organizing ourselves and sorting into areas of affluence and areas of poverty, the continuance of racial segregation in our world. I've become friends with great sociologists like Rob Sampson at Harvard and the brilliant young Pat Sharkey at NYU. Stuck in place. We are the mobile. We can move. We can go. We can find economic opportunity. But too many of us, half of us or two-thirds of us, are literally stuck. Workers who can't move to where economic opportunities are buried in mortgages they can't, underwater in their homes. People who can't afford to are buried in ghettos. And you know what the research says? It's hard for a kid to find his way today like I did. Oh, and I had advantages. I had two parents. My dad had a manufacturing job, but we were poor. And I grew up in North Arlington, and I saw the pathologies. I saw the teen pregnancy. I saw the crime. I saw my friends turn to drug use and drug selling. I saw my friends get shot and die. But at that time, I could get out. I could get a Garden State scholarship with my crappy SAT scores. And I could go to Rutgers on a Garden State scholarship and no longer had to take a beating because I was smart and hide that I was smart. I could be smart. And people said that was a good thing. Ain't that like that today? Trying to get into college or competing with the world. I look at my classroom at the University of Toronto. Same thing at Carnegie Mellon. There's no way I would stand a chance against these kids, the best and the brightest from the world over. Never mind, what the research shows is growing up in an area, you see, what our cities are becoming, and this is really important, folks, are areas of concentrated advantage on the one hand and concentrated disadvantage on the other. Not just our labor market, but our cities are splitting in two. And it's not just in our cities. As our cities come back, as people move to the downtowns, as our great friends at Brookings have shown us, that poverty spills out into the suburbs. So the most rapid growth, although there's still more poverty in cities, the most rapid growth in poverty is in the suburbs. For those of us who are nerdy urbanists like me, the model the Chicago school handed us is wrong. It's wrong. The model of a hollowed-out core surrounded with a central business district, with working-class areas and manufacturing districts, with a flight to density of affluence is wrong. But neither is it just a movement back into the core. We have a fractured, a fragmented, a fractal metropolis now, with areas of concentrated advantage and concentrated disadvantage side by side. What does de Blasio call this? A tale of two cities. Now, we know where we'll get if we stay stuck like that. London has blown up in riots. Rio has blown up in riots. Turkey has blown up in riots. Look around. Urbanists, look around. And what are we doing? Well, people are saying, it's great that the cities are coming back and gentrification sucks. That's our debate. It's Rich Florida and Ed Glazer and Bruce Katz versus David Harvey and all these other people. Oh, you yuppies, you're causing the cities. No. We want the cities to come back. No, you guys are bad. No, that's why the cities are wrong. They're going on the handbaskets because you gentrified them. Huh? It's not an either or. It's not an either or. We have to build one city. And here's the rub. I started this too. I just interviewed my dear friend Ben Barber, Bruce Katz. We're all bound up in this. I wish I had, the guy who titled Rise of the Creative Class, Bill Frucht, is the editor of Ben's new book, If Mayors Ruled the World. I said if I could steal one title, I'd take that one. What a great title. Bill is a genius. Mayors are going to fix it on their own, right? Well, all the mayors are going to get together, and I work very closely with Mike Bloomberg. We just did a city lab with We're going to get the mayors together, and the mayors, John Norquist and Bill Peduto and Mike Bloomberg, We're all going to get the mayors together and they're going to solve these problems. If mayors ruled the world, we'd overcome Washington dysfunction. The mayors will point us in the right direction because they run things that matter. But the mayors aren't going to solve this alone. If we're going to get out of this economic crisis and create a new round of growth, remember FDR? A new partnership with the cities. A new partnership. We're going to need a federal government. The president said this as I was coming down here. The president said this. We have learned that we need government. And without government, our society stops working in ways none of us want. You know what's going to get us out of this crisis is a new round of city building. A new round of city building. And we all have to get together on that. In Korea, you should have heard the jokes I heard about the beautiful airport in Incheon compared to Kennedy Airport. And all across the emerging world, beautiful new airports, high-speed rail lines linking China, and we don't know if we can afford that. As our infrastructure crumbles, and not just our infrastructure, but our mode of geographic formation, our mode of settlement, our built environment. You see, if we want to stimulate demand, we've got to get out of this debate between monetary and fiscal policy, and do we keep the interest rates lower? Do we spend a little more? We got to get on with the prospect of city building, of making sure our cores can thrive, of overcoming the building and zoning nuttiness handed down by the industrial era, and making sure we can increase supply of housing where it's needed, investing in new affordable housing, building transit systems that can get what make people broke in this society. A car, and another car, and a third car, and a house. Building affordable rental housing that people can live in. Anyway, I'm a professor, which means I come from the Fidel Castro School of Public Speaking. I could keep lecturing you all day. I just want to say congratulations to Don, congratulations to Pittsburgh, and to echo how much this city and its transformation has really shaped my thinking and my life. And I know now we have time for a little bit of questions, and you should be as tough at me as you want to be.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
So,
thank you, guys.
Don Carter will be helping to collect questions if you have some. While we're waiting, of course, I have a question. You're living in Canada now, and the Canadian government really doesn't have a national highway program or a transit program. And most of the cities in Canada have pretty good transit. Some of them have excellent transit, despite your current mayor in Toronto. And also their housing tends to be a little smaller because they don't have the mortgage interest deduction, and they don't have national housing agencies that try to enforce separate use zoning. So when you talk about the federal government having a new partnership and mayors looking to build that partnership, are you really sure that would work? And if you look, I was in Detroit the 3 days over the weekend, and I saw the Richard Florida inspired rebuilding of the downtown, and that was good. But did you know that the state of Michigan is investing $1.6 billion while the city lays there in bankruptcy to widen I-94 in the city of Detroit by one lane in each direction? What do you think of that?
We have to, you know this, Mr. Mayor, we have to completely change the way we do infrastructure. And that made sense for the old auto, Fordist manufacturing age. We need a new round of infrastructure spending, which bolsters transit, bolsters rail, bolsters in-city transit, high-speed rail, and we need a new housing policy, which takes away all the incentives for massive overconsumption of barely used dwellings. That's going to take mayors informing a new federal policy, and that's going to be a tough slog. That is going to take us a long time, but we've got to start. Without those changes in federal policy, don't get me wrong, there's a lot mayors and cities can and will do, but we're pushing still upstream.
So infrastructure should add value to the place where it's built.
You know more about that than I, but okay. Absolutely.
All right. So you talk about cities and suburbs. What is your opinion of city neighborhoods that have not come back, the gray area?
Yeah, I think that's really the question. That what we have to do intellectually is build now. We know how metropolitan areas and cities compete and will. We do not have a great theory of how neighborhoods how neighborhoods function, and that's where we're pushing with our research team. How do we begin to look at the neighborhood level? But I think what we're dealing with is a quilt, a patchwork of highly advantaged neighborhoods and highly disadvantaged neighborhoods and gray areas in between, but they're not just urban. Those gray areas in between are both urban and suburban. So trying to understand how cities and metropolitan areas form at the neighborhood level. And then, you know, I'm writing something on what's called the Promise Zone Initiative. Of course, it's a good idea unfunded. But the idea of what we can do to support neighborhoods. And there, I think, places like Pittsburgh, which through its Community Development Corporation infrastructure has stabilized, I'm not saying completely turned around neighborhoods, but stabilized neighborhoods, and then how to turn areas of concentrated disadvantage to areas of concentrated advantage, or an area where more and more people can participate. Those are big questions, but clearly core to the future of urbanism.
What should Bill Peduto do, I hope I pronounced that right, in his first 100 days as mayor?
Well, first, you know, I've thought about this a long time. A friend of mine who worked at the Pittsburgh Tissue Engineering Institute said something very profound to me when I lived here. He said, when you're dealing with regions like Pittsburgh or Detroit or Milwaukee, it's almost at the early stages like you're restoring someone who's had a traumatic injury, disfiguring injury. And it's very hard for that region to get a sense of self and a sense of pride because they've been down. And Pittsburgh is back from that, but Detroit, my wife Ron is from Detroit. You feel it now when you go to Detroit. I think that Pittsburgh has turned the corner, and the first thing Bill has to do is show and make a sense of regional pride. Two, he has to make sure that Bill will do this because he understands it because he's a Pittsburgher and he knows both sides, to make sure that everyone feels like they're part of the team. It's not the creative class versus the working class versus the service class. It's everyone in Pittsburgh. And then I think, Mr. Mayor, he's got to do an urbanist agenda. He's got to do all the things that you've written about. Begin to rethink the highways. Pittsburgh needs much, look at the traffic problems here. They're horrific. He needs to move Pittsburgh away from the car. And, you know, one of the things Rich Daley taught us is that he has to reach out to the suburbs. One big issue here, which I saw, was when we tried to create a Pittsburgh...
Better than me. I told, when Waukesha County wanted Milwaukee water, I told them to dry up and blow away. That didn't work quite as well as...
But here there has been a long-term rivalry, and the suburbs have felt put upon. I remember when a group of suburbs organized themselves under the banner of their area code. Maybe some of you know. So I think reaching out to the suburbs and saying this is not just about the core, it's about the metro, and that's where Bruce has such fundamental insights, but building not only a domestic inclusive, a local inclusive coalition, but a suburban coalition. And then I think he's got to go out and preach. He's not, where I think Bill has to do is he's got to go out and preach this story of comeback to all of the other communities that are feeling that they don't know the answers.
All right, where are you on the Julian Simon thing with the other guy, the population bomb, Paul Ehrlich? I have a question here that says, global resource requirements or resources are running out. Won't the urbanization of the world cause the end of our resources?
Just everybody got that? The idea that we're still procreating a lot. Well, maybe not in America, but around the world. There are still lots of people. The UN projects that our population in the world may go up to about 10 billion. I think urbanization is the technology that's the solution.
It'll save energy.
I think it's urbanization. It's not technical advances of the sort that the whiz kids at MIT and Carnegie Mellon. It actually is the kind of things Volker and Vivian work on. It's urbanization that is smart and I think this is a social movement, but it's got to be more than that. I think many of the younger people and younger thinking people understand that we have to do more with less, that it's gauche to live in a big, giant suburban home and have 16 cars that you don't lose and a bunch of stuff. Building denser urban settlements, we know this, save energy. Getting people out of these pollution-creating cars saves energy. Sharing, the fact that we can share rides, that we can share bicycles. Look, we've made our factories, we know this in Pittsburgh, 24/7, highly efficient places. Our built environment is disgustingly. Any factory engineer who came and looked at our built environment, lights on all night, houses empty 8-10 hours a day, offices empty the same amount. My office at a university empty all week, sorry. It is the most inefficient way of organizing ourselves, so urbanization done right is the key to solving this resource bomb.
How come Switzerland has the highest incomes in the world and no resources? The mountains are made out of dolomite and nothing else. and Russia has lots of resources in their port.
Yeah.
Is it urbanization?
Well, I mean, not having Korea, we talked about this. Koreans say what made them efficient and made them smarter in terms of industrial development and made them denser. 50% of the Korean population, more or less, lives in and around Seoul. Think about that. In this big country with all the sprawling city system, 50%, and I think it's something like 2/3 of their GDP, come from one town because they had nothing. But I do want to comment on this because I think Pittsburgh is the example of how to get around the resource curse. And I wrote about this. I wrote about this debating Tom Friedman. Tom Friedman made the same argument that places that have resources are destined to have a resource curse because having resources make you lazy. And I said, in general, that's been true with a couple of exceptions. Pittsburgh and Cleveland and parts of this belt, which turned resources into the knowledge institutions of, built the Carnegies and Mellons and University of Pittsburghs. Houston is another great example. I talk about the new knowledge energy economy in the US. Houston is another example of galvanizing energy resources but adding knowledge. And the one that I think is even better than us is Calgary. Calgary is a place that has taken abundant natural resources and has built a knowledge economy in a very short period of time and elected another terrific mayor. But I think we in North America have an answer for that. The Swiss do, the Koreans do, but we show that energy, although I do think having a lot of natural resources in a particularly gifted country, we're now the largest energy producer in the world again, has made us kind of lazy in the sense that we've taken our sprawling spatial pattern for granted. We've never had to build density and sustainability the way other countries had to develop, and I think now we finally have to cross that bridge.
All right, we have a question directly from the boss, Don Carter. And he asks, there is a fourth T, territory. Talk about that.
Well, you know, after I wrote Rise of the Creative Class and created these 3 Ts, and you know, the 3 Ts were really built off the Pittsburgh experience. And now all of this has changed now, and it's such a wonderful story, but the reason is, you know, I saw that Pittsburgh had technology, the first T. Pittsburgh was so abundantly blessed with technology. We did the benchmarking, Kevin and I and others at Carnegie Mellon. We did the benchmarking, and what we found is that Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh, on a per R&D dollar basis, were as productive as Stanford and MIT, maybe more so. But our spin-offs and technologies were moving out. So then we looked at the talent T, and we found that Pittsburgh not only had a great school system, but it had these great universities, and at that time, a lot of these young people were moving out, and what I said simply is, we were focused on business attraction and recruitment. This got to be very contested, but I was writing for economic developers. I said, every single person who chooses Pittsburgh, whether they were born here or come from, they're a business, talent, attraction, and retention. And then the third T was tolerance. I looked at Pittsburgh and found that it wasn't, at that time, a place where gay and lesbian people felt that they could be open. It wasn't a place that had a large immigrant population. So I said, when those 3 Ts, it's not one or the other. You know, and let me counter this. Miami had a lot of tolerance and diversity, but had no economic growth. So it wasn't like tolerance was the driver, it was all 3 Ts in combination. After I wrote that, a bunch of people, including Don, said, well, you write a lot about quality of place. You write a lot about these characteristics of places, both the built environment, older buildings, cultural offerings, the green environment, the natural environment. So then we created, I think it might have been Lou Masanti who came up with this, or Kevin, or one of those guys came up with this idea that we have a 4th T, territory and territorial assets. That is the kind of things that urbanists can focus on. But I want to caution. One of the things that's happened as we've made quality of place better, and I think it has to be better, is there's been a mounting criticism from the anti-gentrifying, and I come from this neo-Marxist tradition. But the idea that if you improve a park, you've gentrified the city. You know, if you have a thriving art scene, you've pushed out poor people, and then the artists are going to get thrown out. If you improve the schools now, you're gentrification. My view is we have to marry territorial assets and quality of place with a much more inclusive strategy, because I don't think it's a good thing.
You don't embrace the strategy of keeping the city as crappy as possible to keep the prices.
My mother would have said that's numbnuts. That's just numbnuts. That makes no sense. And I think we as urbanists have to address that head on. To go back to Newark of my youth, when the city was exploding into racial riots and the city was burning, to go back to New York when I went to Columbia, are you crazy? I mean, the people, I don't know what planet these people have been, and the universities, bless their soul, give these people jobs. Great for them. Leave them there. But it is tragic that this group of people in urbanism have gotten so much traction. Look, I'll tell you what I heard in the debate in New York. This was really interesting. I listened to Loda and de Blasio. I thought these guys were from different planets. They both said the city is the core of generating innovation and technology, right? We have to strengthen entrepreneurship, science, and technology. We need more great institutions like a Carnegie Mellon, and they lured Carnegie Mellon along with Cornell to come there. Okay, we need to have more entrepreneurship, strengthen urban tech. We need to have more growth. The problem is then, how do we solve inequality? Here was the difference. Here was the difference. Lotus said we need more economic opportunity. De Blasio said we need better schools. And I'm not kidding you. So they shared this sense that a growing city was a better thing. It created tax revenues. The big issue is then, how do we solve this splitting apart, this dividing city? But it's not going to be solved by going back to what it was. That was an awful place.
Yeah, I remember Abe Beam and John Lindsay and all those people. But let's talk about one of the worst places in the next to the last question. You went to Flint, Michigan, and you got attacked by your buddy Kotkin, saying, how dare you go there, although a lot of people in Flint actually do drink coffee. So, you know, he was poking at that. But what's your optimistic scenario for a place that was so heavily industrialized, and not in small plants, but huge plants? Is there hope for Flint?
So three parts to this answer. One, and Joel and I get along a lot better in person than we do in writing. That's just, you know, people go overboard. I try not to, but people just go overboard when they write. And that makes sense to me, actually. You know, you become a target, and that's okay. It's okay to be a target. And you should learn from that. If you're a target, you should learn from that and try to broaden the conversation. But one thing I do think is that what I would call this line of neoconservative urbanism, which you and I have talked about, is anti-urban. And I think we have to you know, when people are pointing at hipsters in coffee shops and latte bars and artists, that comes from a long strain in our culture of anti-urbanism. And we have to be really, really careful. You know, it becomes very easy to point at like Williamsburg, Brooklyn, Portland. You know, Pittsburgh has the 12th highest rate of productivity growth in the nation, which is pretty good, 3% over the past since the crisis. Portland has the 3rd. So those slackers and yuppies and hipsters are actually going to work. So that's one thing. We have to be careful of that loaded language, and we have to battle back on it. The second thing is, big metros have big advantages, right? We have to be honest about this. Detroit is going to come back because Detroit metro is twice the size of Pittsburgh. And it's unfortunate that its great universities are out in the periphery, but they're in the metro. Pittsburgh is a metro of 2.5 million people. That's got enough stuff to go. Milwaukee is close to Chicago. The Flints of the world has a tougher struggle. They have a tougher struggle, not only because they were so heavily industrialized, but they're further away. We drive through Flint. We go through Flint, Ron and I, a lot. The point is they've got to start to work on their assets.
Okay, now
they've got to start to work on their assets.
Before we break up here this working class issue, I was a lathe operator and a drill press operator. Not very long, but a couple of years. But the guy that ran the United Auto Workers in Wisconsin lived in Milwaukee, lived in a working class city. He could have, you know, lived in the suburbs if he wanted to. And he had season tickets to the symphony. And the UE union, another one, the Allen Bradley, which got kicked out of the AFL-CIO for reasons that I don't want to get into. But they had a program where they got tickets to the symphony, tickets to the theater, and they made that really important. The union made that an important part. Does the working class, does the unions, do they have to work their way back into society and become part of the creative class, or can they be part of it too?
We destroyed the working class. We know this. We separated conception and execution. We broke the mental back of the worker. We have to put that back together. And you know what? It is coming back. We stabilized manufacturing job loss. We have many, Ron and I were national, but this is in every city. We went to this Makers, and we saw all these young people who were so excited to be using their minds and their physical skills to make lighting fixtures and engage in carpentry. So let me be honest. I wrote Rise of the Creative Class because this group of knowledge-based people, the creative class, were being ignored by city management, economic developers. They were considered an afterthought. Whether they were married, single, gay, straight, ethnically diverse, they were off the radar screen. And maybe we put too much attention on them. Take that blame. But at that point, 10, 15 years ago, we had to have that conversation. Now I think there's two things we have to do. We have to shine the light back on the creativity of the working class.
You know what I like?
And the service class, John, and the service class.
You know what I like about you, Richard? You put yourself out there and you get banged at, not just from the right, you get it from, you know, the guy who, anyway.
From the left.
From the left, yeah. I was going to name somebody, but I decided not to. But anyway, so you put yourself out there and you actually listen to people and then try to incorporate, at least acknowledge their thinking occasionally. That's rare. And I think that's one of the reasons that you have so much impact on remaking cities is because you're willing to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.